Tanya, good morning and welcome to the program today. So last week you were going to talk about the engagement checklist. Is that correct? Tell us a little bit about what were some of the items you were going to chat about, and let's pick one and do a little bit of a deep dive.
Yeah, absolutely. So the engagement checklist was really related to retention, right? You've heard me say this now for 2 years. Leaders are worried about retention and recruitment. And my plea to everyone is if you want to solve retention and recruitment, focus on engagement. So that's the first thing. Understand what retention drivers really are. It comes down to engagement. And I was going to encourage everyone to focus on data, right? So often I think it's really easy for us to say, well, I feel this way, or I think this is going on. And so let's get some data around that and have good tools to be able to gather the data. And also, and I keep bringing this up because I'm hearing it day in and day out, we're not doing conflict well in the workplace. And it really is driving people away. But
Well,
I
we're
think,
calling people Grinches. I mean,
well, I
that's not
know.
part of the training programs you would go through at AIM. If for conflict resolution, we don't go Grinch. I mean, we have opinions about Bert all the time, but we don't always share them openly with him.
Well,
Being a Grinch is probably not the best retention strategy.
Yeah.
probably not. I think we all have to kind of do some self-reflection and own how we want to show up in the world.
Yeah.
That's just the best way to improve life overall. Is this really how I want to show up in this moment? But that kind of leads to culture. Like, what do we allow people to do? And I have to say, when Bert was telling the story, it was a chemist. So I was like, wait, was it the Rogaine factory gone wrong? And now it's this green man, and he truly, I didn't know where that was going, Bert. So, but yeah, I
No,
think
that
really,
guy became the Joker.
oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
But so really what I think we're going to focus on today is really how all these things come together in its culture, right? And that's really what I'm trying to get everyone to understand. Look, I am an Oregon Trail baby, right? I'm a Gen Xer through and through. And when I was in high school and college, my job was to go around. I was a temp worker. So I filled in for all the reception and positions. And I'd sit down at the reception desk, and time again, across from me would be this gold lettering on the wall. This is our mission and these are our values. And it always struck me as funny because it was meaningless, right? It was great words. They had paid companies a lot of money, but when I felt how it felt in those organizations, they weren't living by their values. And that's so much of what drives culture. So yeah, I think that's what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah. So to me, that's the one that really drives much conversation when I'm sitting with the CEO. And I sometimes even don't like to use the word culture. Tim, who runs our marketing department, he's always wanting to throw that in there, and I get it. But for me, I struggle with it to talk about culture because it's used in such a way that I'm not sure we really understand what we mean when we say culture, right? It's people will say, well, we have a nice culture. We have ice cream and we do hot dogs, or we have pizza parties, or we celebrate birthdays. And I guess in some sense that is part of culture. That's part of who you are and how you do some things. But that doesn't mean you have a good culture. That doesn't mean you have a healthy culture. Those same organizations, when that's their focus, they're not necessarily achieving retention, which we know from our survey is the number one concern from the C-suite for 2024 is retention. So tell us, when you think about culture and you're talking about it in your presentation there, let's dive a little deeper there.
Yeah, so let's start to wrap some like definition around it because culture really is those behaviors and beliefs that are exhibited. And I think that's the key thing in it. We can define it all we want, but if it hasn't made its way throughout the organization, in both stated ways and unstated ways, right? If I'm meeting with my manager and I'm getting feedback, I want to know how my behaviors support or don't support the stated values and culture of the organization. So we need to be talking about it. And through that, if we actually make it part of our culture, we develop these prevailing values and norms. And it's not just in the way that people act, it's also the systems we have within our organizations. It's how we make decisions. And that should prevail throughout everything. And so, you know, I think leadership has a responsibility of defining that, of setting the example. And then we have to work to make sure that employees are living by those values and standards, so that they start behaving the way that we want them to. And the reason we're talking about this so often right now is, you know, the Grinch is a great example, right? People think they can just show up and I can show up however I want, and you just have to accept that. And I don't think that we have to do that in the workplace. Everyone can have space to be who they are, but show up in a way that supports the values and the environment that we're trying to create. And whether you are intentional about this or whether you are not intentional, it's deeply embedded in your organization. And so if you've let this be a void, everyone's behaving in a way and creating a culture. And so my encouragement to everyone is that you can change your culture, but it takes a lot of intentionality and it doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah. In fact, some of our speakers at our conference were focused on how they intentionally changed it. And some of the messages were very interesting, right? So you talk about, okay, well, Phil's talent is maybe hiring good people. That's my own genius. And I would agree with that. And good people do good things, but we don't go around and call each other Grinch. And you'll talk a little bit about psychological safety often. I'll hear you. That doesn't mean you have the ability to come in and be inappropriate at work, or to be mean, or to be the Grinch at work. And I think what you're really talking about is companies will have values, and they'll be posted, they'll be in their handbook, they'll be on the wall. They do all kinds of things to promote their values visually.
Yeah.
They don't necessarily then put those values into practice. And I think that's what I'm hearing you say is, how do we put those values into practice? Do you have any examples of how that can look for someone? You know, like they'll have trust as a value, they'll have open communication as a value. Some of them aren't, you know, that genius in and of themselves in the language, but they're very, very important. And I'm not minimizing the importance of saying trust or open communication. Can you dive into that a little bit?
Yeah. So I think values express, like when we're in an individual, the only way that you know what my values are is through my behavior, right? If I say that I have high integrity, do I show up on time? Do I, you know, admit mistakes? Do I communicate? Those things, you can see that through the behavior. When we think about organization values, they're really reflected through systems and processes. And what I mean by that is, so let's say that we have a value that we want to be innovative. And then I pull your budget out and I look at your technology spend, and there's no budget for technology spend. Well, how are you going to be an innovative company, right? And employees see through that. If we say that we want to, trust is a great one, right? We say we want to have trust in our employees. And yet our policies are, if you're 1 minute late, you get written up and you have points deducted. How is that fostering a sense of trust, right? So we need to talk about that thing. And the way we would have that conversation, gosh, Bert, you had no idea we were going to use the Grinch example through this whole thing, right? But Grinch shows up to
Oh my
work.
goodness. Oh
Yeah.
my gosh, look at that.
Yeah. There's the Grinch. There he is.
Way to go, Nick. I love it. But
Phil
you know,
Grinch.
if I'm the person who is calling that person a Grinch or the Grinch, as a manager, I can use and leverage values to talk about this, right? Like we want to foster a community of respect, right? That's one of our stated corporate values. So Grinch, what I noticed in your behavior is your communication style tends to be abrupt. You don't often focus conversations in a way that are difficult, that we come to positive outcomes. I really want you to be successful in our organization. I think you have the right things to do that. And so I want to bring you in alignment with our respect value. What tools do you need? Do you think going to some sort of training around conflict would be helpful for you? Is there something going on at home that maybe I just need to be aware of? Do you have too much on your plate? So we can talk about those values. And then on the flip side, that manager or whoever walked in and said, oh, there's the Grinch, you know, same conversation. It is important in our culture that we have a value of respect, that we're fostering. And I noticed that you're frustrated, right? And it came out in name calling. That doesn't seem to foster what we're trying to really develop here. So how can we bring you in alignment? What frustrations are you having that we can solve those rather than taking a short track to name calling? That's how values work in the corporate environment.
One of our speakers, and I forget which one it was, it was definitely one of the keynote speakers that we had, mentioned one way that they project their values through their culture is that once a week in their meeting, they start the meeting and everyone has to bring an example or a couple of examples of innovation to the meeting from that week.
Yeah.
And innovation is a value to them. It was obviously very important to their business model, but that's an example of the very top of the organization, having a structure that brings the value to life versus saying, we're an innovative organization, we value innovation, but they don't have any forum in which it's ever discussed or brought forward. And I thought that was a good example. Because we see that the likeness for that for me is, Nick, what are you doing to me here? All right. I got a few names in mind for you, Nick, but I'm not going to do those because I value you.
Phil, I know you've been working out a lot, but that's quite a shape you've developed there.
Look at the shoulders there. Yeah. Yeah. Hey, the likeness of that, and Chibs would be happy if we brought it up, is, when someone wants to bring up, we start every meeting with a safety topic.
Yep.
Right? That's an example where your value is safety. We care for people, so we start a meeting with safety. Well, what are the other values that you have, and where and how do they get projected into your business model? And that's the example I often will refer to is safety. Great. Okay, you start every meeting. Where and how do you do that for trust or communication or whatever the values are? Innovation from that standpoint.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. It has to start at the top. And what I love about talking about culture and values is that's really where we connect into engagement, right? Because engagement really is that emotional and intellectual commitment to the individual group that we're a part of, right? And so if I walk in and I'm like, well, we say we value safety, but there's water on the floor, I don't have the tools I need, I don't have the safety equipment I need, then I don't feel connected to that in any way, right? And so now it's just words. Where if we start with, hey, we don't start any meeting until we have a safety tip, then now I'm like, okay, I can share that. I can plug into that and I can show these things. And so that to me is engagement. We have to say this is who we are, right? Through our culture. We have to use our values to shape our behaviors, our processes, and our systems. And when we get that right, employees have a very clear picture of how they can engage in the workplace. We get that wrong, or we're not intentional about it, then employees will fill the void. And they'll do it through actions that we don't want them to do. They will do it through behaviors and just attitudes. And so time and time again, what I'm trying to explain to people is engagement isn't expensive. It's just intentional. And a lot of times it's very simple things that we can do. And I think the basis for all of it is know who you are and do that through your values.
Another one of the speakers also talked about how their employees help define the method in which they will celebrate or display their values, right? And that's a big thing for leaders to let go of and or to trust. But the process alone projects often many of the values companies are trying to promote, right? The fact that if we say trust is a value, and now I have a group of people from our facility who are going to help us define how we live out our values at work, that's an example of displaying trust and living with that. And then the hard part for leaders is to accept that. And one thing that the leader said when he was speaking, he said, I didn't change anything at all about what they brought forward. And he said, what would it have said if I asked them to do it and then they brought it to me and I said, yeah, I like it, but I'm going to change this. And, that kind of resonated with me in the sense that you have to trust the process. You have to trust that this is the interpretation from the organization. As long as it's not fundamentally wrong, then you have to go with it. Any examples? I know you work with members all the time in doing that. And I think that was Rich Gund from the Gund Company that talked about that. But is there anything that you've experienced with any members any examples like that to maybe give us some confidence?
Absolutely. We had a member who was really going in crisis. Leadership changed over, really toxic culture, and did an engagement survey, got some data that we needed to look at, knew where we needed to go in. And trust was a major issue in the organization. Employees didn't trust what was being said. There hadn't been good follow-up. So we did a 2-hour workshop. It was 2 hours. This is how easy this can be. We got all the employees in the room. It was a smaller employee, about 50 employees. And we said, here are posters around the room, divide up in groups. And what I want you to do is I want you to talk about the value of the organization. What do you do for your customers? We wrote all those words down. We got them back on posters and we said, what is the value of your job? Like, what do you bring here? What is it that you're actually doing? And so we got to just a number of words. We went and, eliminated the duplicates. This was all like freehand. And then what we said is, okay, we agree on, say, these 10 words. Now go back to the posters and tell me how that's demonstrated. Give me examples, behaviors, and actions that we do that. And in a matter of 2 hours, we had narrowed that down to about 6 values that everyone agreed on. And then they formed a culture committee. That culture committee went and wordsmithed those 6 values. And when I came back 3 weeks later, we had values for the organization. Now, for employees that felt like they didn't have trust, that they didn't have meaningfulness and connection in the workplace, how do you think those employees feel now? They just wrote the company values. So now,
and they wouldn't have felt that way should the leader then said, "Oh, I like that, but I'm going to change these things." That's right.
And they didn't. They gave the employees, and then the leadership then got on board with it and said, "Hey, this is how we're going to incorporate it." So that to me is a really powerful example of not a lot of effort, not a lot of spend. And now when we had almost in the focus groups, 60% of the employees saying, "Hey, I'm ready. I'm done. I'm not doing this anymore." They've had 100% retention among those groups, and nobody left that way.
That's amazing stuff.
That is a great story. Yeah, that's a great story. And that cost them 2 hours of time. All right. We're going to have to wrap it up. Tanya, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you once again for tuning in to This Week at Work. If you enjoy the show, please share it with your colleagues. Forward our invites. Share the link, aimea.org/thisweekatwork, or follow or subscribe wherever you get your news and entertainment, like LinkedIn, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. We're everywhere you are. And you can be part of the show. Send your questions and comments anytime to info@thisweek.work. We'll see you next week, 7:30 a.m. Central Time, when we discuss what's happening this week at work.